I woke up to the sound of the ocean claiming everything I knew. It wasn't a gradual transition from sleep to wakefulness. It was a violent, cold, and suffocating reality that hit me before I could even draw a full breath. In the absolute pitch black of the Atlantic Ocean, 30 meters below the surface, the silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I reached out into the darkness, my hands hitting cold steel and freezing water. And that was when the realization settled into my bones like the chill of the deep. I was alone. My crewmates, my friends, the men I had laughed with just hours before, they were gone. The Jacson 4 tugboat had become a tomb, and I was the only soul left breathing inside it. The morning of May 26, 2013, started like any other day in the Gulf of Guinea. I was the cook, usually the first one up to prepare breakfast for the crew. I was in the latrine when the world suddenly turned upside down. There was no warning, no alarm bells, just a rogue wave and a sudden violent lurch that sent the ship into a death spiral. Within seconds, the cabin was upside down. I remember the sound of heavy equipment crashing, the roar of water rushing through the corridors, and the frantic screams that were quickly silenced by the weight of the sea. I struggled against the rising tide, fumbling in the dark, gasping for air as the room filled. I managed to find a pocket of air in a small corner of the technician's office. I sat there, chest deep in water, shivering uncontrollably. The temperature at that depth is a predatory thing. It leaches the life right out of your skin. I was wearing nothing but my underwear, stripped of everything but my basic instinct to survive. For the first few hours, I shouted. I called out the names of the others, hoping for a faint reply, a splash, a groan. Anything to prove I wasn't the last heart beating in this iron coffin. But the only response was the creaking of the ship's hull as it settled into the seabed, and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of something moving in the water around me. Time doesn't exist when you are buried alive under millions of tons of seawater. It becomes a thick, heavy sludge. I tried to keep my head above the surface, but the air was changing. Every breath I took felt heavier, more metallic. I knew enough about the sea to know that I was breathing my own death. Carbon dioxide was building up, and the oxygen was slowly vanishing. I found a piece of wood and some tools to create a makeshift platform so I could stay out of the freezing water as much as possible. I knew if I stayed submerged, hypothermia would take me long before the air ran out. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a physical weight pressing against my eyes. To keep my mind from fracturing, I prayed. I talked to God. I promised him everything if he would just give me one more glimpse of the sun. But then the sound started. The ship was settled on the ocean floor, but it wasn't dead. I could hear the scavengers. Large fish, perhaps sharks, had found their way into the sunken vessel through the smashed windows and open hatches. I heard them tearing at the remains of my friends in the next cabin. I heard the snapping of bone and the splashing of tails. I pulled my legs up and stayed as still as a statue, terrified that any ripple I made would draw them to me. I was a guest in a graveyard and the residents were hungry. One day bled into the next, or was it 1 hour into the next? I had no watch, no sun, no stars. Hunger started as a sharp pain and then faded into a dull, aching hollow. But the thirst was worse. I was surrounded by water, yet I couldn't drink a drop of it. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I began to hallucinate. I saw my wife's face in the darkness. I smelled the food I was supposed to be cooking. I heard voices calling my name from the surface, only to realize it was the shifting of the wreckage or the internal groaning of my own mind. I was waiting for a death that felt inevitable. I thought about my family, about the things I hadn't said, and the life I had taken for granted. I prepared myself to die. I even wrote a final message in my head, a goodbye to the world I was sure I would never see again. Then on the third day, a new sound pierced the silence. It wasn't the sea or the scavengers. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thudding. It sounded like a hammer hitting metal. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. Was it a rescue team? Or was it just my mind playing one last cruel trick on me? I took a heavy wrench I had found and started banging on the side of the hull. I hit it with every bit of strength I had left. Bang, bang, bang. I waited. Nothing. I did it again. I screamed until my voice broke, but the water muffled everything. I felt the hope drain out of me, leaving me colder than before. But then I saw a light. It was a faint, ghostly glow moving through the murky water outside my pocket of air. I thought I was seeing an angel. The light grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of my tiny sanctuary. It was a diver. I saw the silhouette of a helmet, the bubbles rising from his suit. I reached out and touched him. I didn't want to scare him, but I needed him to know I was real. When my hand touched his suit, he recoiled in pure terror. He wasn't expecting to find life in a place that had been declared a recovery site for corpses. The diver, a man named Nico van Heerden, turned his light toward me. For the first time in 60 hours, I saw a human face. He looked at me with wide eyes, his breath coming in fast gasps through his radio. I couldn't speak. I just reached out my hand. He took it. That grip was the strongest thing I have ever felt. He didn't let go. Through his headset, I could hear the panicked, disbelieving voices of the surface crew. They were shouting, "He's alive! We found one alive!" But the ordeal wasn't over. You cannot simply swim to the surface from 30 meters after 3 days. My body was saturated with nitrogen. If they pulled me up too fast, my blood would boil and my lungs would rupture. The divers had to bring me a diving bell. They had to keep me in a pressurized environment, slowly acclimating my body to the pressure of the deep before we could even begin the journey up. I spent more hours in that dark water, now wearing a mask and a harness, guided by these strangers who had descended into hell to find me. When I finally broke the surface, the air felt like a miracle. Even inside the decompression chamber, where I would have to spend the next several days, the sensation of being out of the water was overwhelming. I cried for hours. I cried for the 11 men who didn't come up with me. I cried for the sheer impossibility of my survival. The doctors told me later that I shouldn't have made it. Between the CO2 poisoning, the hypothermia, and the psychological trauma, I was a walking miracle. For a long time after I was rescued, I couldn't go near the water. The sound of a splashing wave or the sight of a dark room would send me spiraling back to that air pocket, back to the sound of the scavengers and the feeling of the freezing Atlantic. I would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced that the ceiling was closing in on me. They call it a miracle, and in many ways it was, but it was also a burden. Why me? Why was I the one spared while the others were taken? Today I look at the ocean differently. I respect its power, but I no longer let it rule my fear. I eventually went back to the water. I even became a diver myself. I realized that I couldn't spend the rest of my life running from the very thing that tried to claim me. I was given a second chance, a gift bought with the lives of my crewmates, and I owe it to them to live every second with purpose. I am Harrison Okene, the man who was buried at sea and lived to tell the tale. I spent 60 hours in the jaws of the deep, and I learned that even in the most absolute darkness, as long as you can draw one more breath, there is still hope. Survival like this reminds us that the human spirit is capable of enduring the unthinkable. If you found this journey as gripping as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We tell the stories of those who faced the impossible and came back to tell the tale. Your support allows us to keep digging deep into the most incredible accounts of human resilience. Don't miss our next story. Subscribe now and join us as we explore the limits of the human will. Thank you for watching.